All right, so let's get to defining externalities and market failures. So an externality, what is it? It's basically the cost or benefit of a market activity that affects a third party. And what do we mean by that? We basically mean that a third party is someone that's not involved in the market transaction, basically. So a common example is cigarette smoke, secondhand cigarette smoke, right? Maybe you're at a restaurant, you're sitting outside, and someone is smoking a cigarette. And for most people, even if you're a smoker, secondhand cigarette smoke isn't a very pleasurable odor. Okay, so that would be a external cost, right? Because you're not the one smoking the cigarette, but nevertheless, you're being affected by it negatively. Another example that's a little more silly and lighthearted, but it's a real world example, is when your neighbor is cooking some really good smelling food, right? You smell their home cooking. It's, just smells delicious. It's kind of making you hungry. That's a positive externality, right? Because you are in no way involved in the market transaction of buying the food or cooking the food or making the food or eating the food. But nevertheless, you actually get some benefits from just smelling it because it smells good, right? So that's what externalities are, and that's what we mean by imposing costs or benefits on third parties. It's the third party is someone that's not involved in the market transaction. Okay. Now, as it turns out, when there are externalities, this leads to market failures. And this is basically anytime there's an inefficient allocation of resources in a market. So we've already seen plenty of examples of market failures, right? With excise taxes, with price controls, with types of firms that aren't perfectly competitive. So monopoly, oligopoly, monopolistic competition. We've seen a lot of examples already of market failures. And so it's basically just anytime there's deadweight loss or any loss of efficiency, basically, but almost always involves some deadweight loss. So that's a market failure. And so there you go. Externalities are one type, and I just listed a whole bunch of other types that we've already seen. Okay, so when we're thinking about these externalities, we basically want to break down the costs and or benefits into some subcategories. Okay, so we can break it. These costs, we're going to mostly think about externalities as costing society, but they also can sometimes be beneficial externalities. But pollution, for example, is a negative externality. So let's think of it in those terms, right? Pollution. So with pollution, there are internal costs of the pollution, but there are also external costs of the pollution, thus externalities. And then we can talk about the social cost, which is basically these two things, internal and external costs added together. Okay, so what are internal costs? The costs of market activity paid only by the participant, right? The person or firm creating the pollution. Okay, so this is like not the third party cost. This is the normal cost that we think of that's internal to the firm. It's internal to the market activity. Whereas external costs, these are any costs that are imposed on people that aren't participating in the market. Okay, so the cigarette, secondhand smoke, for example. And then, like I said, the social cost is both of these things added together. When we consider both of these costs, that gives us the total cost to society. So the social cost.